Good morning and welcome to this morning's webinar. My name is Lee Biggington. I'm one of the co-founders of Nephos Technologies, and this morning I'm going to be talking to you about our SmartDiscovery service. Throughout the presentation, I'm going to touch on kind of four areas, if you like. I'm going to give you a brief introduction into Nephos, who we are, what we do, why we exist. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we see in the market in terms of data governance challenges today. And then I'm going to run you through our SmartDiscovery service before we close out with some Q&A. So who are we? Who are Nephos? So we are a specialist data services integrator. We are a privately held UK organisation founded in 2013, and our focus is on helping large companies to solve complex data problems. That's kind of what we do. We are consultancy-led. Typically, this is driven by the fact that our clients are looking for some sort of transformation work in the norm. And they quite often know what the end state is that they're trying to get to. But getting there is a challenge for them. You know, understanding new technologies, understanding how they can integrate those new technologies to drive transformation is often very, very challenging for them, particularly when you consider that most organizations from an IT perspective are delivering or being asked to deliver more, but with less resource. You know, that drive on BAU makes innovation very, very difficult for most people. So our customers are typically looking for someone that focuses in that area and that can help drive innovation. And that's kind of what we do. So, and that's been proven out over the last 4 years in particular, as we've seen on average 120% compound revenue growth. And our clients that we do work with have been with us for a long time. I mean, we don't typically lose many customers in that sense. So we run a minimum 98% customer retention. That's been consistent since our start, really. And we put that down to the fact that, you know, we're 100% focused in what we do. We only do one thing and we do it well. And that focus is really what helps us with our clients. So why do we exist? I mean, I've touched on some of it there on the previous slide, but ultimately, data is driving pretty much every single business decision these days. It's the bedrock of what we do, and it's only going to continue in that vein, in our opinion. But what we find is when we're speaking to customers is that there are very few partners or integrators that they can work with that have that kind of independent level of expertise, that understand those new technology sets, that don't cost the earth, that can actually drive some real value. And, you know, ultimately these customers, these companies are looking for someone that's expert in data to help them through that journey, you know, from getting through from where they are now into whatever their end state needs to look like. And that's ultimately why we came to market, was to fill that gap, to be that independent expert when it comes to data. And we do it for some of the largest organizations in the world across pretty much every single vertical market you can imagine. So whether that's the like of Genomics England, where we've worked with them to rebuild their data processing infrastructure for genomic data for the next 5 years, or you look at the likes of TBWA and Omnicom Media Group, one of the world's largest advertising agencies, you know, helping those guys to centralize media content and provide them the ability to collaborate across the globe on those platforms. You know, or whether it's someone like Condé Nast, the publishers, where we've helped them on their cloud transformation journey. So, you know, moving them from where they are today into a hybrid cloud model and optimizing the infrastructure that it lives on. You know, any of these organizations kind of all have the same challenge. It's all about data. It's all about how do we store it, how do we process it, how do we protect it more effectively. The same can be said of the likes of CMC Markets, where we've helped them to put in an AI platform and a machine learning platform that helps with real-time advertising, for example. Now, over the years, and if you look at what we do in general terms, we've built out our own data framework that we kind of apply, and this really highlights three core pillars, if you like, in terms of our areas of focus. Starting bottom up, the first part, and where as a business, I guess we started before that whole AI and machine learning piece came to the fore. It's all around data processing and storage. Quite often people have an awful lot of data, but they really struggle to drive any value from it because it's stored inefficiently. There's multiple silos and pockets of data infrastructure. It makes joining those things together and managing that environment really, really complex for them. And it inhibits their ability to drive value from their data. So ultimately, our work here focuses on optimization, driving cost saving, on increasing performance. We have the security and data governance aspect. So really, this is all about trying to bring data science to data governance, if you like. How do we move away from an environment that's purely regex based, that is clunky, for want of a better way of putting it, and difficult to scale when it comes to data governance, discovery, and enforcement of policy? How do we control that in a more effective way? How do we leverage some data science to kind of optimize the accuracy of those things? And then the final part is here, this data analytics and data management piece. This is really bringing in AI, machine learning, deep learning. How do we support those platforms? How do we automate data science? How do we help our customers to reduce time to value? And how do we maybe even help them monetize those core assets and drive some real value from it? So there are our three core areas of work, if you like. And I mentioned earlier, we are very consultancy led. Our consultancy services, or smart services as we call them, are there and designed to help customers to develop and execute on their data services strategy. That's really what they're there for. And they've been developed over time based on customer need and customer requirement. So in many cases, these services have been generated off the back of, I guess, repetitive implementation of these things for customers. How do we help optimize infrastructure with smart data objects, smart file? How do we do these things? Sorry, how do we optimize those? How do we help you migrate and build out a strategy around cloud infrastructure? How do we help with your AI and machine learning and deep learning environment? How do we optimize that? And what we're going to be talking about today is that smart data discovery piece. So how do we discover, classify, and identify risk when it comes to your data, regardless of where it's stored? And that's what I'm going to come on to next. So, smart discovery, what is it? Well, it's all about bringing visibility into your key data assets. That's ultimately what we do. And the reason this has come to the fore is numerous, really. If we look at today's data challenge, the first component part that we quite often see here with customers is that they have too many tools. So to support all of the various platforms and data types that organizations run these days, there are a myriad of tools that people use. It costs money, it takes time, it makes, I guess, cleanup and troubleshooting and breach detection very difficult when you've got so many tools across so many disparate infrastructures and not one single place or one single view of your data. And that makes life very, very difficult. So that's the first challenge that we come to. The second is cloud. I think without question, the majority of customers that we speak to that are adopting cloud or have already adopted cloud don't have suitable governance frameworks in place or control points in place to be able to do that, or to control their data, to know what's being done in those cloud services. Now, this doesn't make cloud bad. This is just about making sure that you apply the same rigor the same governance process to data in cloud as you do on premise. That's really what this is about. And the last piece is a general lack of visibility. And this cuts across everything really. So, whether that is on-premise infrastructure where you might have developers that are copying production data into non-production databases, for example, for testing, whether this is data being uploaded and shared via Dropbox when your corporate policy is OneDrive, whatever it might be, there's a general lack of visibility here. And what makes it worse, particularly in a cloud context, is that a lot of the traditional, most if not all the traditional tool sets that you would use to get this level of visibility have no visibility over the API. They have no ability to understand the difference between corporate and personal Dropbox accounts, or a Chrome extension for Evernote, or whatever it might be. That once you get down to that API level, which is ultimately driving most things these days, they have very, very little control that they can place over it, and very little breadth over what they can control. And that's kind of the last piece of the puzzle, if you like, in some of the data challenges that we see. I'm just going to expand on a couple of those now. So if you look at the coverage and the API component part that I just touched on, if you want to clock back 5, 10 years, whatever it might be, you got a really clean, clear perimeter, right? All of the data that you were storing was pretty much within a data center or data centers. Traffic was very much east to west. Reasonably contained and controllable, and probably your biggest concern was people with USB sticks taking data out that they shouldn't have, or Active Directory permissioning being lax, or whatever it might be. But this is what it looks like today, right? This hodgepodge, this mess of interconnected apps and services, some on premise, some in cloud. It causes a real headache, and it opens up the amount of attack vectors that you're open to, and the amount of risk when it comes to your data, really, whether that's through leakage or otherwise. And this is the thing that we're looking at in terms of the lack of coverage that traditional tool sets have. Now, if you think about it, and these stats come from one of our partners. On average, only 5% of cloud apps are known trusted apps, right? And we know this. We've seen this through running our discovery service on multiple occasions. There's one financial services institute, and they had over 100 times the amount of cloud services running in their environment that they thought they had. So we know that there are a number of applications and services that will be running in pretty much every single business that IT has no governance and control over. And we also know that over a third of data is living in the cloud. So, as I say, this comes from one of our partners, an annual survey that they run for their client base. So, they're typically high-end enterprise organizations across the globe. And we, as I say, we know that a third of that enterprise data lives in the cloud, but only 5% is in known good applications. So there's instantly a gap there. And that gap's made worse by the fact that for every single one of those known good services that run, what we would call an anchor tenant, there's going to be around 25 ecosystem applications in use. So what do I mean by that? Well, ultimately, if you use something like Chrome, for example, or Slack or Salesforce, the ability and the ease at which you can connect via an API to a third-party application from that anchor tenant, that's really what we're talking about here. So, I mean, I do it myself. I use Chrome. I have plugins for a number of things. Ultimately, it gives me the ability to move data between cloud services over an API. So ultimately what it's doing. As a user, as a consumer, that's not necessarily the way I see it. I see it as a productivity tool that lets me do my job properly. So, that kind of coverage just isn't there with traditional infrastructure security. So not only have you lost the east-west simplicity and the border, but you've now opened up an API economy that enables your users to move data freely across the internet with very little checks and balances. The risks themselves aren't much different to that you'd expect in a traditional environment, right? There's concern over theft, people removing data through unsanctioned means that shouldn't be removed. There are exposure concerns, so people sharing data publicly before it's due to be shared. There's been, I don't know how many famous instances of this when it comes to things like product launches, for example. All of these things are a challenge. And likewise, we're starting to see more concern over things like misconfigured cloud infrastructure, hybrid threats that come in via the cloud. So whether that's things like malware through things like OneDrive, for example. All of these challenges, all of these risks are even more prevalent in a cloud environment than they were in a traditional on-premise environment. Again, that doesn't make the cloud bad. That just means you need to think about what you're doing with it. And you need to pay some attention to the governance aspect before you start consuming. So how do we get visibility over all of these things? How do we deliver that level of visibility into your infrastructure, into what's being used and where and by who? That's what our SmartDiscovery does. It's exactly what it does. It's a consulting engagement that helps us identify risk when it comes to your data. So we don't care whether it's cloud, on-premise, whether it's structured, unstructured. We have the ability to provide you visibility into your data, regardless of where it is and what it is. We apply a risk score to that to make sure that you have the right level of governance and you're able to remediate risk. That's what we're doing. There are kind of 4 different aspects to it. So digging into the coverage a little bit more, there's kind of 4 different aspects to that. So the first thing that we're able to do here is look at cloud usage. So I'll start at the top. Very, very straightforward. In fact, so straightforward that we don't actually need to deploy anything. All we need are some log files from yourselves. We pass that through our system, and then we go and analyze and assess the applications and services that we're seeing running. So that will help us identify things like top talkers, things like whether you've got people using Dropbox on the network or strange, wonderful things like WeChat or whatever it might be. But that gives us visibility into cloud usage. So really here we're highlighting the unknown. This is all about the unknown cloud usage and unsanctioned. So that's shadow IT risk, if you like. The next 2 parts here are all both done via API. So we have the ability to go and look at IaaS configuration as an example. So quite often this becomes, or this is becoming more relevant for customers that are heavily adopting public cloud infrastructure. So AWS, GCP, Microsoft Azure, whereby they want to make sure that their environment is configured correctly to avoid risk of data loss. That's really what they're looking at doing. And the cloud's no different to anything else, right? You will buy a platform, could be any platform, you deploy it, and day one it's kind of deployed, hopefully in its optimum state. But over time that changes, configuration changes. People start doing things, maybe using it for edge cases that it wasn't designed for. And the configuration changes over time. The cloud's no different to that. Configuration can change over time. So you need to make sure that actually that doesn't expose you to additional or unnecessary risk. That's what we're doing there. Same can be said of SaaS. So if you look at things like Office 365 and OneDrive for Business, they quite often cause challenges around or confusion for users about what data should be stored where. So quite often we see customers that their policy is that they will use OneDrive for Business for home drives or home directories, for example, but nothing confidential should be in those OneDrive accounts. They should be on traditional file servers, file storage. Okay, that's fine, but quite often the user can get confused with that kind of approach. So quite often, through no malicious means or intent, quite often that data can be stored incorrectly. So what we're able to do is connect into those environments over the API. So again, no need to deploy any physical hardware or software on site, all done over the API. We're able to assess the potential policy breaches that may be in place in those environments. So, whether you're using things like open access links on files, for example, in OneDrive or Google Drive or Dropbox or whatever it might be, as an example. But we're able to identify those policy breaches. These two things really are about known cloud services that you run. So if you look at cloud usage up the top, that's very much about unknown. IaaS and SaaS, very much about known. So we're actively connecting to the API or over the API to those environments, and we're risk assessing on your known environment. That's what these things do. The last piece is the on-premise aspect. So this kind of comes back to something I mentioned earlier. Particularly in large organizations, it's very easy to lose track of data. It's very easy to have things stored in places they shouldn't be stored. Again, through no malicious intent, it's just usage over time. So you need to have visibility and control over that. And you need to be able to understand where the risk might be. You need to understand, more so than ever with GDPR and those the increased regulations around data. You need to be able to identify your data. You need to be able to tell people exactly what you're doing with it and where. And that's really what we do for on-prem. So this is all about connecting into that infrastructure, discovering the data sets and the assets that you have, classifying those assets or mapping against your existing classification program, and identifying areas of breach. And I don't mean breach in terms of a proactive hack. I mean breach in terms of policy breach. The process itself is very straightforward. So all of our engagements, all of our consulting engagements are based on fixed price. So we have a very kind of, I guess, rigid process in that sense, albeit very fast and quite streamlined. But all of our work, all of our consulting engagement is based on a defined statement of works. So the first stage of anything is to spend some time with yourselves, understand the deliverables. So what are you looking for out of this? What's the end state that you want to get to? What's valuable for you? Understand the prerequisites. What do we need to be able to deliver it? Because actually, and this has happened before, we've run into situations where a client can't meet our prerequisites for us to be able to meet the deliverables, and therefore we can't progress. So we need to understand that first off. That's our first part. We then develop a statement of works with a clear set of deliverables and process in it, and timescale, and that drives a price, so a fixed price for the work and for the output. That's kind of the first stage, really, or the first two stages of the process. Once we've done that, everything's agreed and executed. We'll then either take collection of log files in this case, or connect up via an API in this case. There's an element of data capture. So we have our own tool sets that we need to use to analyze your data. So the next phase is to either deploy those or collect data from you to feed into them, depending on what we're doing, and capture that data. We take the output of that, we analyze it, our consulting team analyze the content, and then we produce deliverables from that in line with the scope of works into forms. So The first is a full written report. So that's really all about kind of the full soup to nuts summary of the engagement, what we found, how we remediate, all of those good things in long form. But what we also know from experience is that quite often there needs to be a short form or a diluted version of that that can be shared within the business. So we also provide you a management deck of that information as well. And that management deck is kind of a distilled version into the highlights, lowlights, and key findings. So without some of the preamble. Also, as part of those deliverables, what we give you is a remediation set. So, how do we fix the problems we've highlighted? Once that's done and everyone's happy, you sign off on that program, we sign off, and it's marked as closed. And that's the end of the engagement. So I just wanted to touch briefly on the cloud aspect of this. So, how do we identify risk in that sense? How do we measure that risk from a cloud perspective? It's a question that often comes up. So from the IaaS standpoint, what we do is we map configuration against over 44 best practices. So that's CIS, PCI, best practices from the cloud providers themselves, so AWS, Azure, GCP. We're looking for things like misconfigured identity and access management, those kind of things. We detect those misconfigurations, we flag their criticality, and we also give you a series of remediation steps. So, how do I go into AWS and change the configuration to be best to map against best practice? How do we map that against NIST framework? Those kind of things. And likewise, when we look at the unsanctioned kind of cloud components, so this cloud risk assessment here, we map against 12 core aspects. Now, within each of these, I'm not going to read them all out, but within each of these 12 core elements, there are a number of sub-elements within them that make up this risk weighting. These are our standard percentage weightings. We can configure those to map more in line with your requirements. Should you need us to, that's absolutely not a problem. And actually, quite often we will do that just to make sure that the output is relevant. What's important to you might not be important to me, and vice versa. So what do we give you as part of that? So from a cloud standing, we're going to identify, as I mentioned earlier, top cloud apps, users, and high risk elements. So are you using very undesirable cloud services, for example? Are you using services that are known to have data breaches? Those kind of things. So we're going to identify all of that in terms of the unknown, and we're going to give you a view into that landscape. We can classify data across every single source and every single type that you might have in that sense. And we're also able to identify policy violations against regulations. So whether that's GDPR, whether that's maybe data sovereignty related. So quite often we see customers where they have contractual obligations with clients to keep data in certain regions. So being able to identify that kind of thing. PII discovery, so being able to identify PII that's stored inappropriately, for example, and even in some cases, the right to process that you're required to meet for things like GDPR, being able to identify data that's being stored that actually shouldn't be, because you have no right to process. And the configuration analysis piece as well. So how do we make sure that the base configuration is, the simple things are done well and correctly? I mentioned this earlier, but just to talk you through a brief case study from one of our financial services clients. About a year ago, we ran this piece of work for them. Now, they're a UK financial services shop. There's about 25,000 users. They gave us a list of 32 trusted cloud apps that they used, but they knew when they were going into this that they absolutely didn't have visibility into everything that was being used. They have a lot of third-party contractors, developers, they have outsourced partners, you name it. It's a very, very broad spectrum of service providers in that space. Now, as part of that, what they wanted to do was basically run a gap analysis on what was being used in the cloud that they weren't aware of, and also to build out off the back of that a framework of control points and governance points. And that's ultimately what we did. So the base of all of that was done from log file analysis, start to finish. The whole process took 3 weeks. When we first passed the logs that we were provided, we identified over 100 times the amount of cloud services in use. Now, a large proportion of them were good, relevant, should be there, absolutely great, but they needed more visibility into that environment. And to give you an example, one of the things that we did find was a really odd plugin that was being used that one of their web development teams had put in to enable their customer services teams to speak to clients via chatbots through Slack. There was a plugin being used as part of that that when licensed was over £500,000 a year in license fees. Now, the application itself was fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But what it did highlight was that they were duplicating effort. So they did, for another project, already have a similar service running on a product that they'd already licensed. So there was actually no need to spend the additional funding that they'd allocated to do that when they could actually just reuse licensing that they already had. So aside from the governance and the control point, there's also a practical kind of vendor management aspect here that we can provide visibility into in terms of unknown costs. Quite commonly, we'll see there was a construction firm that we did some work with that were running. They used OneDrive for Business. Sorry. So what they found was that they had over 3,000 Dropbox accounts on their network. Now, yes, some of those would have been personal accounts, but by the same token, quite often, the reason end users are using something other than what IT have provided is either because they don't know it exists or it doesn't do the job properly. So, they took a different approach and said, you know what, clearly we have an issue here, and clearly what we're providing isn't doing the right job for our people. So let's repurpose the licensing we have. When we come to our renewal, we'll move away from what we've provisioned as IT, and we'll adopt Dropbox on a corporate basis to then go and better support our users. And then we're not wasting money, and we're giving users what they want. So how do we use this information to make things better? So these sorts of examples are pretty common across the piece once you understand what it is you're actually using. So to wrap that up, just to conclude there, from a smart discovery perspective, what do we do? Well, ultimately, the reason we're doing what we're doing is because the traditional tool sets that you guys are using, or most companies are using, don't have enough coverage, don't have the ability to look into that API tier to be able to give you a full level of visibility into what cloud usage is, or in fact, to be able to track usage for internal environments. So that's the first thing. It's really all about giving you the level of coverage that you need across on-premise and cloud. Second thing is the process is simple. We can drive value anywhere between 2 and 6 weeks, start to finish in these sorts of engagement, to really give you very simple, very fast access with really broad coverage to your environment and your data, all at fixed cost with no surprises. That's the takeaway. So I wanted to close up just to add slightly. I mentioned earlier on that most of our services are generated off the back of discussion with customers. You know, where are the gaps? And our Smart Discovery service has been immensely popular for that. But quite often, customers will come back to us and say, "Look, this has been fantastic. We've exposed a lot of gaps in the environment. That's great. But how do we do this on a continual purpose? How do we do this? Excuse me. How do we do that on a continual basis? How do we make sure that we don't slip back into this issue in 6 months' time?" So we've taken our Smart Discovery service on a step further, and we're launching our Smart Data Governance offering, which is in essence a managed service whereby we'll provide that visibility to you on an ongoing basis, subscription model. Touch on some of these. We've been through some of these anyway as part of the process, but I think the thing that makes this really interesting that we're adding into it is the use of data science. So quite often, a lot of the traditional tool sets that are in use, even if they do provide the coverage, are regex based. So in most cases, we see them as only as at best 80% accurate, which is a massive issue for organisations. You know, it's all well and good having expensive tool sets to go and do these things, but if they're not accurate, then the data is almost irrelevant. So being able to expand on just regex and bring in an element of data science into that model enables us to drive much faster accuracy, much greater accuracy of results, and cut out some of the noise as well that you're probably suffering from. So that's a really important part for us. So the idea is, as part of that model, is that we will provide you with a single dashboard into your data. So wherever it lives, so whether it's on-premise, whether it's in cloud, and whatever it is, so whether it's structured or unstructured, we will provide you with a single view into your data and the risk that is associated to it. We will discover and classify your data for you, and we will feed that into that dashboard too. So we'll be able to identify and classify data regardless of where it is, and we will be able to present that back to you in a very simple form that's easily understood. We also provide with that, I guess what you would call more traditional managed service capabilities around reporting, automated reporting, and a service management function. So that's the baseline element of what we're doing there. What we're also able to do, though, is take that a step further and drive that into these enforcement points. So quite often, it's not really enough to just gain visibility on its own. You're going to want to do something with that data afterwards. So what we're folding into that is the ability to add in identity and access management controls, multi-factor authentication, looking for things like least access privileges on cloud applications, for example, into this IDAM piece. In data encryption, so the ability to encrypt and make sure that data is encrypted based on policy, at rest, and in motion. So being able to enforce automatically that encryption of data. We're able to incorporate log management. So whether you want to take that or not, these enforcement points are options, kind of functional options that you can add on as part of the subscription. But being able to provide log management capability as well into that is something that we're offering. And the last part is all around kind of cloud security, CASB type capabilities. So and that kind of secure access edge, if you like. So being able to control access to cloud resources, being able to incorporate secure web gateway capabilities and CASB all into one single platform for you. So again, we can deliver that all as one single consolidated subscription model. The real purpose behind this is for us to take away the operational overhead that comes with managing all of this stuff. So our role will be to deliver that single platform for you, to remove the operational overhead. So your focus is then on controlling policy, making sure that policy is being enforced correctly, and those sorts of aspects, rather than managing the underlying platforms. We stand this up for you, we apply your policies to it, and we're basically enforcing your policy for you. Some core principles to that. So, ultimately, common things: we have no access to your data at all. All of that control point is with you. So really, we're just enforcing your policies for you and maintaining the underlying environment for you, just to make it easier for you to focus on the things that you really want to be focusing on, which is driving some value out of that data. Ultimately, as a managed service model, what we're able to do is scale that operation, if you like, to drive out cost, and give you faster response times for things like compliance requests, like DSARs or right to be forgotten or whatever it might be, across all of those data platforms. So just to wrap that up there, I'd just like to thank you for your time today. Thank you for joining us on the webinar. The slides will be provided, and the recording will be provided via email, or via a link on email rather. So if you do want to go back and rewatch any of it, please feel free to do so. There's also example reports that we have that we're happy to share at any point should you want them. Just reach out to your account management team, or you can reach us online or via email. We'll be more than happy to help. Thanks again, and I hope you enjoyed it.